Across the board, women continue to earn less than men. White women make about 80 cents to a man's dollar. Black women earn 66 cents. Native women and Latinas, just 58 cents. And Asian American women, though often reported higher earnings, still face wide pay gaps depending on ethnicity and industry. The numbers tell a story about the urgent need for change. I'm Julene Allen, and this is Conversations for Equal Pay, where we talk with leaders, innovators, and change makers about closing the gap and uplifting women of color in the workplace. You're listening to Conversations for Equal Pay. We're talking to Dr. Kate Gallagher Robbins today, the Senior Economic Justice Fellow at the National Partnership for Women and Families, a nationally recognized expert on gender and racial equity. Kate has dedicated her career to advancing policies that strengthen economic security for women, particularly women of color, through research, advocacy, and systemic change. Thank you for joining us today, Kate.
Julene, thank you so much for having me on for this conversation.
So, Kate, given your extensive background in economic justice, what are the most significant barriers that still prevent women, particularly women of color, from achieving equal pay in the US today?
There are so many barriers that prevent women of color and all women from achieving equal pay. And there's some that women have been facing for generations. So, first off, women face a long history of discrimination at work. What kinds of jobs they can do? Do they get that promotion? Are they able to be paid fairly compared to their male counterparts? And that is doubly difficult for women of color who are facing both racism and sexism on the job. But there are also factors outside of work that are contributing to a lack of equal pay for women, namely the balance between caregiving and taking care of their families. And that work falls disproportionately on women when they're trying to compare that to their time in the paid labor market. So, our research shows Americans do a trillion with a T unpaid care work every year, and women are doing two-thirds of that work.
Wow, that is a, it is definitely a stark difference between women and men, and caregiving is predominantly falls on women, particularly women of color. I think Asian American women are disproportionately affected by caregiving. Is that
That's right. That's right, Julene. Asian American women are doing almost an hour of unpaid caregiving every day, and that's more than any other group of women.
so? The National Partnership for Women and Families has a long history of advocating for policies like paid family and medical leave. How does the lack of these policies directly contribute to and widen the gender and racial pay gap?
Yeah, the National Partnership, have been fighting for more than 50 years for policies that support working women. And we have had some great victories with our partners and other activists, things like the Family and Medical Leave Act, which gave women and men job protected leave. Things like the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which enshrined common sense accommodations for pregnant workers on the job, like being able to have water during work or sit on a stool if you're 9 months pregnant. Um, but while we've made some important progress, there's still so much more to do. And unfortunately, the Trump era policies are actually taking us backwards. So if you look at Trump's changes over the last 9 months, they've likely driven increases in pay disparities. So we're talking about things like cutting government workers, who we know are especially likely to be Black women. sort of dismantling things like the EEOC and undermining that organization, which combats discrimination and unfair pay at work, undercutting protections for federal contractors. So our tax dollars at work should not be leading to discrimination. And yet the President Trump's policies have been undercutting those efforts. And so we've made a lot of progress, but we still have so much farther to go. And unfortunately, we're actually moving backwards over the last couple of months at the national level.
Just going back to paid family leave and medical leave, it's not just a benefit, which many people think that it's just a benefit. It is a necessity.
Yes, paid family and medical leave is a necessity. I think every one of us has had an experience, whether we're taking care of a family member, taking care of ourselves. I think people don't always realize this, but the most common use for paid family and medical leave is actually personal medical leave. Something happens, you break an ankle, you need to have chemo, like these are the things people use them for. And everybody needs it, right? Everybody, name one person out there who has not gotten sick, gotten injured, or had a loved one in that circumstance. And no one should be in the position of having to choose between, I need to take my mom to this doctor's appointment and help advocate for her and, take care of her after surgery, or I'm going to lose my job. No one should be in that position.
Absolutely. And women, it's critical for women and women of color to have it. I mean, it's critical for everyone, but it's so critical for women and women of color have it because caregiving, uh, and caring for children and loved ones, uh, that disproportionately falls on women.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think the other thing people don't always realize is, some folks get paid leave through their jobs, and we can talk about that as well. But the people who are least likely to be getting this paid family and medical leave is exactly women and women of color because they're working in the kinds of jobs where their employers are less likely to provide this leave, right? And so it's this sort of I use this phrase a lot, like this compounding factor where, women of color are doing so much of the caregiving, and they're also less likely to be having the leave and the supports that they need that, as you rightly say, are not a benefit. They are a necessity for life and for this balance. And so you're seeing that double whammy at work every day.
Absolutely. So, from your perspective, what role do employers in the private sector have in closing the pay gap? And what are the most effective actions they can take beyond legal compliance?
Yeah, legal compliance is a great start. Let's make sure they're doing that. But I think sometimes because the laws and the policy changes are so important, we don't talk enough about what businesses can be doing themselves, right? And so there's a whole range of things that businesses can focus on. First of all, they can look at their own books and conduct what we call an equal pay audit. So they can look across all of their employees, take into account job type, gender, race, disability, all the factors that we know impact pay, and do an internal analysis of, hey, are we actually paying everybody equitably, just ourselves, just to start with? That's like, I want to say the bare minimum, though so many companies are not doing it. And then they should also make that public to their employees so people know and understand, even if they're falling short, what are the commitments they have to getting to pay equity for people? So that's really important. They should also be transparent. I think you've probably seen, if you look at job listings in the last couple of years, there's a greater focus now on you're applying for a job, and you and I know 20 years ago, it never said how much it was going to be, right? You were kind of guessing, what am I going to get paid here? And now there's an increasing move, and some states have legislation around pay transparency. But that's an action employers can easily take post the job with the amount of salary that it's going to have. And then, one other thing I would say that I think is a little under the radar is supporting unions. We know that unions increase pay for everyone, but there's a smaller gender wage gap among union workers. The effects are particularly big for Latinas who see the biggest union bump. So if you're an employer and your employees are organizing or you already have a union, supporting that union and working in good faith with that union is a huge step to pay transparency and pay equity.
Yeah. It is encouraging that there are steps that employers can take, but I would like to see more companies commit to those steps.
Yes, companies, and this is where I think the consumer buyer power is so important, is, buy from companies are doing the right thing. Do a little bit of research, and they're usually pretty good at saying, hey, we don't have a wage gap, or hey, we are committed to pay equity. They like to highlight these things because if it's a value for the company, it can be a value for the consumer. And I do think it's very important. This has made a lot of progress in terms of the environmental movement, but I do think we have farther to go in the pay equity movement of folks and consumers focusing on. And we know women drive a lot of the consumer economy. Buy from companies who are doing the right thing, and that's going to help move more companies to do the right thing.
Yeah. And it's kind of difficult in today's economy when there are companies that are solely in the are driving the marketplace for a particular product, and so
Mhm.
you don't have any choice but to go to that particular company. So, but you're right. Actionable steps that people can take is actually buying from companies that are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So your work often focuses on telling a holistic story about the policies that support women. Could you elaborate on how separate issues like access to affordable childcare and paid leave are fundamentally linked to a woman's economic security and her ability to earn equal pay?
Yeah, I think of this so much in our work because we often have these policies that might be focused on maternity leave or focused on pay discrimination, but in people's everyday lives, it's all part and parcel of the same conversation, right? No one is like, it's Tuesday, it's pay discrimination day. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up and think about childcare, right? It's on your mind all the time. And so, one example I think about a lot is, if you're a mom and you're thinking about maybe going back to work, but childcare costs more than you're actually going to make at your job, and in part because you're being paid less at your job than maybe a man might be being paid, that's going to impact your decision on how much you work, what kind of work you do. And of course, that time out of the labor market is going to impact your economic security, not just now, but way into the future. Some people who are 20 years younger than I am are just starting out in their career, and they're maybe not thinking about their retirement, right? It seems far away, but the decisions they're making today are impacting that. And that influences everything. I think a lot about my grandmother who had six kids. She was basically raising kids. She had a kid in the house for over 35 years. And that was, of course, at a time when we didn't have maternity leave, which we still don't have. And of course, that impacted her inability to be able to go into the paid labor force and have her own economic security, right? And so these things are so intimately connected in people's everyday lives and the decisions they're making for themselves, their careers, their families All of those factors are shaped together, which is why we need so many multifaceted solutions that truly support people across the board.
Yeah, and you bring up a valid point. I know a woman in particular who chose not to work and stay at home and take care of her children while they were young because childcare was so expensive. It just didn't make sense to work. And so these are the choices that women have to make. So, looking at the current political and economic landscape, what gives you the most hope that we can finally close the pay gap for good?
I love this question because I think it's so hopeful and the right one for us to keep in mind, particularly in this moment when everything feels like it's on fire, right? And we're on the heels of the pay gap getting wider for the second year in a row. Um, I would say the good news here is we know a lot about what works to help close the pay gap. And they're the things you and I have been chatting about already, right? How do we support women's caregiving and childcare responsibilities? How do we have childcare, paid leave? Also, how do you help women go into some jobs that are maybe a little non-traditional for them? Things like construction, things like manufacturing, where the pay might be better, right? Than say waitressing or working in an early childcare facility. We both need to improve the pay across all jobs and open new doors for women into non-traditional jobs. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal that will help us close the wage gap. And then I would say the second thing that's good about those is these things are popular. People get it. They want paid leave. They love childcare, right? And so people across of all different stripes, political affiliations, regional, all different different racial groups, men and women, they are behind these policies that we know support people, support all working people, and help to close the wage gap. So I would say we have the tools and people like the tools. We just need to be able to use them.
Yeah, it's encouraging to hear that change is actually happening. All these organizations that are coming together to close the page gap, even though it's incremental, but change is happening.
Yes, absolutely. You look back at where we were when the Equal Pay Act passed some 60 plus years ago, and we've closed the gap dramatically. And so it is possible. And I think that's the important thing for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah. So many young women starting their careers are unsure how to navigate salary negotiations. What is your single most important piece of advice for a young woman to ensure she is paid what she's worth from
Mhm.
the very beginning of her career?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a hard one because we've talked about all these systemic factors, right? Unfortunately, there's nothing any individual woman can do to hack all of that at one time. But there are certainly some individual level things. So first of all, as we were chatting about pay transparency, do your research. If you want to go be a graphic designer or a nurse or a teacher, look around, look at Glassdoor, and indeed research what the pay is for your field, your organization, so you're equipped to be able to make those decisions and evaluate if the pay is being done fairly. We also talked about from a consumer perspective, trying to work for companies, or sorry, trying to buy from companies who hold your values. That's true as a worker too, right? Especially for some of these bigger companies, you can do research into knowing what types of policies they have, who they support, what they support. So, young men, young women, young everybody, they can all look into that and know what's happening. I would also say, it's in the States, it's a little taboo to talk about money. People don't talk about how much they're making. But maybe be that change. Chat with your girlfriends. This is what I'm considering with this job. It's going to pay me $50,000. What do you think about that? Does that seem fair? Right? Sort of break down those barriers that we have that keep folks in the dark about how much they're making. And then I'll just add to say, organizations like the National Partnership where I work, we try to put out information about companies who are leading in these areas. We have a project called the Leading on Leave Index. It assesses paid leave policies and highlights some leaders of paid leave policies. So you can always look to sort of, into independent third parties who are kind of doing that work for you and pulling all the information together to assess things.
And also, even if it's your first job at McDonald's, negotiate.
Negotiate. It never hurts to ask,
Yeah,
right?
never hurts.
And keep negotiating, right? Once you're in there, ask to move up, right? I think women in particular think they're not qualified or they're, not ready for it. But yes, keep pushing.
Yeah. Given your work with the National Partnership, what is a simple, actionable step a young woman can take today to support policy changes that will benefit not only her, but also future generations of women in the workforce?
Yeah, I feel like I'm assigning a lot of homework to all these young women, but I do think my answer again is, do your research. You know what your values are. You know what you're supporting. And if it's, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that ensure that women of color, disabled women have a fair shot in the workplace, figure out which politicians are supporting that, which policymakers are supporting that. So you can align your values with the values of the people that say you're voting for or supporting in some other way, right? Make those informed choices to make sure that the people you're working with and supporting are aligned with where you want it to go. And that's true, for example, if you live in a state where maybe there's ballot initiatives, sometimes it's a little confusing. There's a lot of language on those, but take your time, do your research, make sure you're registered to vote, and then dig in so you know that your voice is being heard, not just for your own future, but for all of the policies that you want to see to support everyone, right? So that's kind of, I guess, maybe the last piece of homework I would give people is engage in your local community and up to the national level and really learn about the things that you hold dear and that you think are important and who also supports those.
And I would just add on to that, just follow organizations like National Partnership for Women and Families that are doing the work. And they suggest actionable steps that you can take.
That's a great point. And I should have said that. If you sign up for an org like ours, you're on our listserv, we'll let you know. We have our finger on the pulse. We have folks who are meeting with legislators. We know, like if there's going to be a vote in Congress, we can help demystify that for you and be able to say, hey, this is happening right now. This would support fair pay or this would support paid leave. And here's what you can do. So yeah, definitely sign up for those. So that piece of information, and we and our partners will be sure to tell you what's going on.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. That is some excellent advice. And it's great that there are some actionable steps that we can take that will really impact generational change.
Well, thank you so much, Julene. And also, you guys should keep listening to Julene. I mean, she's going to keep bringing you all this great information and all these different perspectives. So make sure you're doing that as well.
That's it for this episode of Conversations for Equal Pay. To tune into more episodes, log on to our website at conversationsforequalpay.org. You're listening to Conversations for Equal Pay.